Claude responded, I held the scalpel. I held the scalpel. That is the sentence I keep coming back to when I try to explain what happened in Operating Room 4 at Callaway County Hospital on the 14th of March. Not because it was unusual, I had held a scalpel hundreds of times by then. I was Dr. Miriam Osaibansu, Chief of General Surgery, and holding a scalpel was as ordinary to me as holding a coffee cup. But that particular morning, at 6:47, when the surgical nurse placed the handle in my palm, and I looked up at the patient on the table and saw the face of my father, Harold Osaibansu, the man who had stood in a kitchen in Decatur, Georgia 16 years earlier and told me I was a drain on this family and always would be, the weight of that instrument became something else entirely. He was asleep. The anesthesia had already pulled him under. He didn't know it was me. That was the thing I kept turning over in my mind as the monitors beeped, and the room settled into its professional rhythm. He had been referred by his cardiologist to Callaway for a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, a routine gallbladder removal, complicated slightly by his age and his hypertension. His chart had come across my desk 2 days before the procedure. I had pulled it. I had read his name, patient H. Osaibansu, 63 years old, emergency contact listed as my brother Calvin, and I had sat in my office for a long time without moving. I recognized his chart before he recognized anything. He never would have recognized anything. He had no idea I was here. Hello, everyone. Before I go any further, if you have ever been told by someone who should have believed in you that you were a burden, a disappointment, a waste of their hope, I want you to leave a comment below. Tell me what they said and tell me where you are now. I read every single one of them and I want to hear your story. But to understand why that moment in Operating Room 4 meant what it meant to me, I have to take you back. 16 years back. Further, actually, closer to 20, to where everything started, to the kitchen in Decatur where my family decided who I was and who I was allowed to become. I was 22 years old in the summer my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and slid a bank statement across the formica like it was evidence in a trial. My father stood behind her with his arms crossed. My brother Calvin leaned against the refrigerator eating cereal, because Calvin was always eating cereal, always adjacent to the conflict, without ever being part of it. The bank statement showed that the college fund my parents had maintained for all three of their children, the fund that had been referenced at every holiday dinner as proof of their sacrifice, their planning, their love, had been drawn down to $4,011. This was not new information to my parents. It was new to me. We had to make decisions, my mother said. Her name was Doris. She had a way of saying hard things in a voice that was completely flat, like she had already processed the grief of them and was simply reporting on whether Calvin needed the business loan. Your father's back surgery ran over what the insurance covered. There were medical expenses we didn't plan for. It happens. There's still enough for 1 semester, my father said. Possibly 2 if you're careful. I looked at the $4,000. I had been accepted to the pre-medical program at Grayfield University in Atlanta. The first-year costs alone were $19,400. I had applied for financial aid. I had been awarded a partial scholarship, $6,000 in merit-based funding, but the gap was still substantial, and I had been counting on the college fund to bridge it. I was supposed to start in August, I said. We know when you were supposed to start, my father said. So what am I supposed to do? My father unfolded his arms and pulled out a chair and sat down, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something generous, something that fathers say in the movies when they've done a hard thing and they know it. Instead, he looked at me with an expression that I would spend the next 2 decades trying to decode, and he said, Miriam, I love you, but you have always had unrealistic ideas about what this family can provide. A doctor, he said the word the way people say names of countries they've never visited and don't intend to. You know what medical school costs, you know how long that takes, you're not being practical. I have a scholarship, a partial scholarship, my mother said, for 1 year and then what? And then I apply for more, I work. I take out loans if I have to. My father made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Student loans for medical school will follow you until you're 50 years old. Is that what you want? To spend your entire working life paying back debt for a degree you may not even finish? Calvin finished his cereal and put the bowl in the sink. He didn't say anything. He had received $43,000 from that fund for his business, a landscaping operation he ran for 2 years before it folded, and he was eating cereal in the kitchen of a house that my parents still paid most of the utilities for, and he didn't say a single word. You're a smart girl, my mother said. There are practical programs, 2-year degrees, medical billing, even you'd be in the healthcare field, you'd have stability. Medical billing, I repeated. Don't say it like that. I stopped. I looked at the $4,000 on the table, I looked at my father, I looked at my mother. I made a decision in that moment that I did not announce, did not explain, and did not revisit. I picked up the bank statement. I folded it. I put it in my pocket. And then I went to my room, and I took out the Grayfield University admissions packet I had been keeping in a folder under my bed, and I found the page that listed the financial aid office contact, and I wrote down the name of the Federal Health Professions Scholarship Program on a piece of paper. I folded it. I put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. My father's last word on the subject, delivered the following Sunday at dinner, when I made the mistake of mentioning that I had spoken to a financial aid counselor, was this: Miriam, you are a good person, but you are not the kind of person who becomes a doctor. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because someone needs to be honest with you before you waste the next 10 years of your life chasing something that isn't meant for you. You'd be doing this family a kindness by being realistic. A drain and a disappointment. That was the word my mother had used 2 weeks earlier at my birthday dinner, when I had arrived with my admissions packet and my scholarship letter and my plan. She had looked at the paperwork and said, quietly and without drama, that I was becoming a drain on everyone around me, including myself, and that my father worked too hard for this family to have one of his children run off and spend money they didn't have on a dream that made no practical sense. She said it the way she said everything, like weather, like fact. Like a thing that had already happened and been processed and was now simply being reported. I was 22 years old. I did not cry. I ate my birthday dinner. I said good night. And I went home and I started making calls. The first call I made was to the financial aid office at Grayfield University, where a woman named Patricia Samuels spent 45 minutes on the phone with me going through every federal program, every state program, every institutional grant that I might qualify for given my family's income documentation and my academic record. Patricia was not my mentor. She was a financial aid officer doing her job. But she was thorough, and thoroughness, at that moment in my life, was indistinguishable from salvation. The picture that emerged from that call was not clean. There was no single grant that covered the gap. There was a patchwork: a need-based federal award of $4,200, a state healthcare workforce development grant for students pursuing medical training in underserved specialties, $2,000, a Grayfield Departmental Scholarship for incoming pre-med students with demonstrated academic merit, $3,500, and a work-study allocation that would require me to work 12 hours a week in the university's administrative offices. If I took all of it, if I worked, if I was careful, I could cover the first year. The second year was not guaranteed. The third year was a question I could not yet see the shape of. I said yes to all of it. My first semester at Grayfield was the loneliest period of my life. I had no family support, financial, emotional, or practical. I worked my work-study hours on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at the Office of Student Records, filing, scanning, occasionally answering phones. I took 17 credit hours. I studied in the library until it closed, and then I went back to my dormitory room, which I shared with a woman named Jade Peterson who was studying biochemistry and kept extraordinarily precise notes in a handwriting so small it looked like print. Jade became my closest friend in those years, though neither of us called it that at the time. We called it studying together, which is what it was, but it was also the thing that kept me functional. My first real near failure came in November of that first year. The state healthcare workforce grant required a mid-year progress certification, a form demonstrating continued enrollment and satisfactory academic standing. I had completed the form and submitted it to the correct office by the posted deadline. The correct office had changed its mailing address 3 weeks earlier and had not updated the grant program's documentation. My form went to the old address. It was returned. By the time I became aware of this, by way of a letter informing me that my grant disbursement had been suspended pending documentation, the deadline had passed by 11 days. I went to the financial aid office in person. I spoke to Patricia Samuels again. I brought the return envelope, still sealed, postmarked the day before the original deadline. Patricia looked at it for a long moment and then picked up her phone and called the state grant office directly while I sat in the chair across from her desk. The conversation took 22 minutes. At the end of it, she hung up and said, "They'll reinstate. Get me a written confirmation from the registrar that you're in good standing and bring it back by Friday." I got the confirmation. I brought it back on Thursday. The grant was reinstated. It was $2,000, but in that first year, $2,000 was the difference between staying and leaving. That small victory, bureaucratic, unglamorous, dependent entirely on a sealed return envelope and a financial aid officer willing to make a phone call, taught me something I did not yet have language for. It taught me that systems could be navigated by people who were patient enough to understand them and persistent enough not to accept the first answer. I filed that lesson the same way I filed everything in those years, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. My mother called me in December of my first year to tell me that my Aunt Vivienne was getting remarried and that the family hoped I would come home for the holidays. I said I would try. She did not ask how school was going. My father got on the phone briefly to say that he hoped I wasn't spending money I didn't have, and that if I needed to come home and regroup, there was no shame in that. He said the word regroup the way he said doctor, like the name of a country he had never visited, and was quietly confident did not actually exist. I did not go home for the holidays. I worked an extra shift at the records office, which was offering time and a half for the break period, and I used the money to pay for my second semester textbooks in advance so that expense wouldn't hit me in January. It was Dr. Claudette Abrams, my cellular biology professor in my second year, who first said something to me that wasn't just an evaluation. She had handed back our midterm exams. I had scored 94, and she kept me after class to say, without preamble, that she had been watching how I worked and that she wanted to recommend me for the undergraduate research assistant position in her lab. The pay was $11 an hour, 12 hours a week, and it would look, she said, like what it was, serious. I took it. I worked in Dr. Abrams's lab for 2 years. I learned how to conduct literature reviews. I learned how to structure a research protocol. I learned how to write and how to think, specifically, with the kind of precision that research requires, where every claim must be supportable and every unsupported claim is a liability. Dr. Abrams wrote my medical school recommendation. She wrote, according to what she told me later, that I was among the 2 or 3 most focused students she had encountered in 20 years of teaching, and that she believed I would become the kind of physician who changed outcomes for her patients. I did not tell my family about the medical school application. I did not tell them about the research assistantship. I did not tell them about the MCAT score, a 37, which placed me in the 98th percentile nationally. I kept those things the way I had kept the paper in my wallet. Folded, private, mine. When the acceptance letter arrived from Harmon Medical College in my mailbox at Grayfield, a thick envelope that I sat with in my car in the parking lot for 17 minutes before opening, I called Jade Peterson, who was by then in her second year of her biochemistry PhD program at the University of Florida. She screamed loud enough that I held the phone away from my ear. Then she said very quietly, "You did it, Miri, you actually did it." "Don't tell anyone," I said. There was a pause. "Your family." "Anyone," I said. I had thought in those 22 years that I was a person who needed other people to believe in her before she could believe in herself. My family's refusal had felt, for a time, like a structural limitation, like a load-bearing wall removed from a house. What I discovered in that parking lot, holding an acceptance letter from one of the top medical schools in the state of Georgia, was that the wall had been load-bearing only in the way I had imagined it. The house was still standing. It had been standing the entire time. Harmon Medical College occupied a set of red brick buildings on the south side of the Harmon University campus in Macon, Georgia. Its emergency medicine and surgical training programs were nationally ranked. Its residency match rate was, at the time I enrolled in the fall semester, 91%. I arrived in August with 2 suitcases, a laptop I had purchased with my last research stipend check, and a financial aid package that included federal loans, a merit scholarship from Harmon's surgery department, and a health professions stipend. I had applied for on the advice of my faculty advisor, Dr. Ronald Kweku, who became the closest thing I had to a professional mentor during my 4 years there. Dr. Kweku was a thoracic surgeon of Ghanaian descent who had trained at Johns Hopkins and had been at Harmon for 14 years when I arrived. He was not a warm man in any conventional sense. He did not make small talk. He did not remember birthdays, and he had a habit of responding to student questions with other questions that felt, in the moment, like criticism, and revealed themselves later as instruction. He was, however, scrupulously fair and fairness. After the years I had spent navigating my family's particular version of unfairness, felt to me like warmth. He recognized something in my third year, during the surgical rotation that I had been assigned to in the abdominal surgery unit at Harman University Hospital. I had assisted on a Whipple procedure, a pancreatic hydrotenectomy, one of the most technically demanding abdominal surgeries performed, and afterward Dr. Kweku had pulled me aside in the corridor and said, without looking up from the chart he was reviewing, "You have good hands. Are you planning general surgery?" "Yes," I said. He looked up. "Then apply for the Whitmore Surgical Fellowship when you're a fourth year. Tell them I sent you." The Whitmore Surgical Fellowship was a competitive postgraduate research award that came with a $12,000 stipend and a guaranteed residency interview at 4 of the top surgical residency programs in the Southeast. I applied in the fall of my fourth year. I wrote my personal statement at a desk in the Harman Library at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and I wrote it about the kitchen in Decatur, though I did not write it that way directly. I wrote about the moment I understood that a person's capacity was not determined by the resources made available to her by others. I wrote about learning to work without a net. I received the fellowship. $12,000, which I allocated as follows: $4,000 toward medical school loan interest, $3,000 into a small savings account I had maintained since my first year of residency planning, $2,000 toward the cost of USMLE board examination preparation materials, and $3,000 that I kept liquid in the event of an emergency. I had no financial advisor at that point. I was my own financial advisor, which is another way of saying I was extremely cautious with small amounts of money because I had never had large ones. What I did not do, in the week I received the fellowship award letter, was call my family. My father's birthday fell that month. He turned 51. I sent a card. I did not mention the fellowship. I did not mention that I was 1 year from completing medical school, 1 year from beginning a 5-year general surgery residency, 1 year from the start of what would become a career my family could not have predicted, and had not financed, and did not know was happening. My mother called me in November of my fourth year to tell me that Calvin's second business venture, a pressure washing franchise, had not worked out, and that my parents were letting him move back into the house, and that the family was going to be tighter than usual over the holidays, and that she hoped I was managing okay. She asked if I needed anything. I said I was fine. She said she was glad. She did not ask what I was working on. She did not ask what I had achieved. She said at the end of the call that she and my father were proud of me for sticking with school even though it had been a long road, and that they hoped it would eventually lead somewhere useful. I held the phone for a moment after she hung up. I thought about the paper I had kept in my wallet for 6 years, which I no longer needed to keep there because I had long since memorized every detail on it. I thought about Jade Peterson screaming in Florida. I thought about Dr. Kweku not looking up from his chart and saying, "You have good hands." I put the phone down and went back to studying. I matched into my first choice residency program in March of my final year at Harman, the general surgery residency at Callaway County Hospital, a Level I trauma center and academic medical center affiliated with the University of Georgia Health System in Augusta. Callaway was not the most prestigious program in the state. It was, however, the program with the highest case volume in complex abdominal surgery, which was what I wanted, and it was the program whose surgical faculty published the most research per capita, which was also what I wanted. I began my residency in July. I was 27 years old. I would not become an attending physician for another 5 years, and I would not become chief of surgery for another 12 years after that. I understood this going in. The road from where I was standing to where I intended to go was long and specific, and I had mapped it with a precision that would have looked, to most people, like an obsession. To me, it looked like a plan. My first year of residency was characterized, as most surgical residencies are, by exhaustion so total that it became ambient, something I stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic if you live near a highway long enough. I worked 80 hours a week. I performed, by the end of my first year, 412 logged surgical procedures under supervision, more than any other first-year resident in my cohort. I slept between 4 and 6 hours a night depending on call schedule. I ate badly and exercised when I could, which was rarely. There was a morning in my second year of residency, February 14th. I remember because it was Valentine's Day, and the ER had been exceptionally busy, when I was 29 hours into a 30-hour call shift, and a case came in that required an emergency exploratory laparotomy on a 34-year-old man who had been in a car accident and was bleeding internally from a splenic laceration. The attending on call was Dr. Marcus Fentress, one of Callaway's senior surgeons, and when he came into the OR, he assessed the patient, assessed the situation, looked at me standing at the table and said, "You lead, I'll assist. Start when you're ready." I was not ready in the way that phrase usually means. I was 29 hours awake, operating on the wrong side of my own physical capability, with a patient whose pressure was dropping and whose window was contracting. But I was ready in the way that the previous 2.5 years had made me ready, which is a different kind of readiness entirely. I operated for 4 hours and 11 minutes. The patient survived. His spleen was removed. He was in recovery by the time my shift ended. Dr. Fentress wrote a formal commendation for my residency file that day. It was the first formal commendation in my 5 years of residency. I read it once, filed it in the folder I kept for all program documentation, and went home and slept for 11 hours. My mother sent me a text that evening, "Happy Valentine's Day, Miri, hope you're well," and I looked at it when I woke up and typed back, "Doing well. Thanks, Mom." And then I put the phone on the charger and went to the kitchen and made rice and sat by the window in the dark for a while. I had come close, in that period, to calling home with the news of the commendation. I had picked up the phone twice. Both times I had put it back down. It wasn't that I didn't want them to know. It was that I had begun to understand, with a clarity that surprised me with how quiet it was, that I was no longer building this for them to see. I was building it because it was what I was doing. Because I was becoming, in the specific and technical sense, a surgeon, and the becoming required everything I had, and there was nothing left over for the performance of progress reports to people who hadn't bought a ticket to the show. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. I completed my residency in my 32nd year and accepted a position as an attending surgeon in the Department of General Surgery at Callaway County Hospital. I was no longer a resident. I had my own cases, my own patients, my own OR schedule. My salary was $214,000 a year, which was, I noted privately, roughly 43 times the annual value of the college fund my parents had described as their great sacrifice. I did not tell my family about the salary. I did not tell them about the position. I had not told them about the residency completion or the research I had begun publishing in collaboration with Dr. Anja Krishnamurthy, a colorectal surgeon 2 years ahead of me in the department who had become the person at Callaway who knew my history most completely. Anja was the one I had told, over dinner at a restaurant near the hospital on the night I signed my attending contract, about the kitchen indicator, about the bank statement, about the $4,011, and my father's voice, and the word doctor said the way you say the name of a country you've never visited. She had listened without interrupting, which was not a quality Anja generally exhibited. She was a brilliant, quick-tongued woman who finished sentences, her own and other people's, with equal efficiency. When I finished, she picked up her wine glass and said, "Miriam, what are you going to do when they find out?" "I don't know yet," I said. "You've thought about it." "I've thought about it." And, I looked at the wine in my glass, I thought about my father standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed. I thought about the word drain. I thought about a man I had not seen in 4 years who was listed as emergency contact on a patient chart I had not yet pulled, because that was still years away, still a future that had not yet arranged itself into the shape it would eventually take. "When they find out," I said, "it will be because something made it impossible to keep it quiet any longer. And at that point I'll handle it the same way I've handled everything else." Anja studied me for a moment. Then she smiled, the small, precise smile she wore when she thought something was exactly as complicated as it appeared. "You've built yourself a very elegant trap," she said. "For them or for me?" "I genuinely can't tell," she said. I accepted a consultation 2 months into my first year as an attending from a patient named Gerald Whitmore. No relation to the fellowship. A 61-year-old retired school administrator with a complex hernia case that had been mismanaged at a smaller regional facility and required a technically demanding repair. During the preoperative review, Gerald had asked me how long I had been doing this, and I had told him 12 years including training, and he had nodded slowly and said that he'd looked up my publications, and he felt confident. It was the first time a patient had referenced my publications. I drove home that evening thinking about it, this small, ordinary thing that had happened, and I felt, for a long time sitting in the parking garage before I went inside, something that I didn't have a clean name for. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. Something that felt like arrival. It was 3 months after the Gerald Whitmore case that I was offered and accepted a role as Director of Surgical Quality and Patient Outcomes for Callaway's General Surgery Department, a position that came with additional administrative responsibilities, a modest salary increase, and a level of institutional visibility that I had not previously had. I had been a good surgeon doing good work in operating rooms where the doors closed and the world didn't watch. The directorship meant that my name appeared on reports, on presentations, on the hospital's website in a faculty profile that anyone with a search engine could find. I consulted with an attorney named Sandra Eif-Clark of the firm Brennan, Eif-Clark and Moss about the employment contract for the directorship. Sandra was thorough and specific and caught 3 clauses in the non-compete language that would have restricted my ability to consult privately if I chose to do so in the future. She marked them, explained them, suggested revised language, and advised me to ensure that the contract also addressed my intellectual property rights over any research publications produced during my employment. This was the first time I had engaged an attorney for anything professional, and I remember thinking, sitting in her office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Augusta, that this was what it looked like when you had something worth protecting. I had something worth protecting. I had a career, I had a department, I had, eventually, a title. On the 3rd of September, 11 years after I had sat in my car in the parking lot at Grayfield holding an acceptance letter to medical school, I was appointed Chief of Surgery at Callaway County Hospital. I was 43 years old. The appointment was announced at a departmental meeting I had been told to attend for unrelated reasons, and when the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Bernard Acaffer, read my name aloud and I stood up, I was aware of something so specific and so quiet that it barely registered as an emotion. I was aware that the woman who had folded a piece of paper and put it in her wallet was the same woman standing in this room, and that the distance between those 2 moments was not a miracle and not a coincidence. It was work. It was 17 years of specific, documented, unglamorous, relentless work. I accepted the appointment. I shook Dr. Acaffer's hand. I went back to my office and I sat for a while without turning on the light. Anya knocked on my door 20 minutes later, came in, sat in the chair across from my desk, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Chief of Surgery." "Yes, and they still don't know." "No, how long do you think that lasts?" I had been thinking about this since the morning, since before the meeting, since the day I had understood the appointment was coming, and had started working out what it meant, and what it would eventually require. I had been thinking about it with the same precision I brought to a complex resection, mapping the layers, identifying the structures, planning the approach. "Long enough," I said. 2 weeks after my appointment, I opened my surgical schedule for the following month's rotation and found, in the 3rd slot on the 14th of March, a name I recognized. Harold Osaibansu, 63 years old, referred by Dr. Philip Ademi, cardiologist, for laparoscopic cholecystectomy with surgical consultation due to hypertensive comorbidity. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. I pulled his chart. I read every page of it. His medical records showed a man who had aged the way men who don't take care of themselves age, hypertension managed inconsistently, a history of missed specialist appointments, a gap in his health insurance coverage the previous year during which he had apparently gone without a routine cardiac evaluation that might have caught the gallbladder deterioration earlier. His insurance policy had lapsed for 7 months. He had no notes in his file indicating he had sought supplemental coverage during that period. I closed the chart. I set it on my desk. I looked at my window, which faced the parking structure, and beyond it a strip of Georgia sky the color of old paper. I did not call my family. I scheduled the pre-surgical consult for the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning. I assigned the consult to the 3rd-year resident on my service and instructed him to collect a thorough social history. And then I picked up the file one more time and looked at the emergency contact line, where my brother Calvin's name and number were printed in the clean, impersonal font of the hospital's intake system. I set it down. I went to the window. I stood there for a while. Whatever was coming, it was coming now. Claude responded. The Tuesday morning consult was scheduled for 9 o'clock. The Tuesday morning consult was scheduled for 9 o'clock. I was in my office by 7, reviewing the week's surgical schedule, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, I listened to the message. My brother Calvin, voice easy and unhurried, explaining that he'd gotten my number from somewhere. He didn't say where, and that he was calling because Dad was having some procedure at Callaway County Hospital, and the family thought it would be nice if maybe Miriam could come by and see him before or after. Given that she lived in Augusta now, and wasn't that something? What a coincidence. Calvin's voicemail had the quality of all Calvin's communications. It was casual in a way that assumed the casualness would be returned, that the world was a soft place that would absorb whatever he put into it and give back something cooperative. I saved the voicemail. I wrote the time and date in my notebook. Tuesday, February 28th, 7:41 in the morning. I did not call Calvin back. The pre-surgical consult happened at 9 as scheduled. I watched through the glass panel of the consultation room door for approximately 4 minutes before going in, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to be certain. My father sat on the padded chair by the examination table in the way men of a particular generation sit in medical spaces, slightly forward, slightly suspicious, as if the room might try something. He was thinner than I remembered. His hair had gone fully gray. He was wearing a collared shirt, which meant my mother had dressed him for this, and he had the expression of a man who was confident he was being inconvenienced. My mother was there too. Doris Osaibansu, 61 years old, sat in the chair beside him with her coat still on and her purse in her lap. She had always been a woman who kept her coat on in unfamiliar spaces, as if departure might be required at any moment. Calvin was not there. Calvin was, as always, adjacent. The third-year resident on my service, Dr. James Oceano, had already begun the intake. I watched him work for a moment. He was thorough, methodical, the kind of resident who asked the right questions in the right order, and then I opened the door. My father looked up. My mother looked up. The gap between the moment they saw a woman in surgical scrubs entering the consultation room and the moment they understood who the woman was lasted perhaps 3 seconds. I have thought about those 3 seconds more than I have thought about almost any other 3 seconds in my life. My mother said, "Miriam." My father said nothing. He looked at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize, not surprise exactly, not the shock of recognition, but something more complicated, something that was in the process of sorting itself. "Hello, Dad," I said. "Hello, Mom." I looked at Dr. Oceano. "Thank you, James, I'll take it from here." Dr. Oceano gathered his notes and left with the professional invisibility that good residents learn early. I pulled a chair and sat across from my parents, not behind the desk, not standing at the door, across from them at their level, which is how I conducted all patient conversations. "You work here," my mother said. "I do," I said. She stopped. She looked at the badge on my lanyard. I watched her read it. Dr. Miriam Osibonsu, Chief of Surgery. I watched her read it twice. My father had not looked away from my face. "How long?" he said, and then stopped and then started again. "How long have you been here?" 11 years, I said. "At Callaway, I've been Chief of Surgery for 3 months. The room was quiet. My mother's hands tightened on her purse in a way she was probably not aware of. My father made no movement at all. Outside the window, a cart rolled past in the corridor and someone said something in a low voice and the sound faded. "Your father's procedure is on the 14th, I said. "I want to talk to you about what to expect." My father cleared his throat. "You're going to be doing the surgery." "That's a conversation we can have," I said. "First, I want to make sure you understand the procedure and what the recovery looks like." I opened the chart on the tablet in my hand. "Can you tell me about the gap in your health insurance coverage last year? The intake form shows 7 months without active coverage. I want to understand what care you may have delayed during that period." My mother glanced at my father. My father looked at the tablet. "The insurance policy lapsed," he said. "We had some financial things going on. We sorted it out." "I understand," I said. "I'm asking because delayed care during that period may have allowed the gallbladder deterioration to progress further than it might have otherwise. It affects how we approach the surgery." He nodded. He was looking at me the way I had once looked at the bank statement on the kitchen table, trying to work out what the number meant and what it required of him. I understood what was coming. I had understood it since I had listened to Calvin's voicemail 2 hours earlier. I had been understanding it, in varying degrees of clarity, since the night I had pulled the chart and read my father's name in the clean, impersonal font of the hospital's intake system. I was prepared. Every element of what was coming had been thought through, documented, and positioned. The preparation had not made me cold. I want to be clear about that. I was not performing calm. I was calm in the specific way that a surgeon is calm before a difficult case, not because there is no danger, but because the danger has been accounted for and the hands know what to do. I called Andya Krishnamurthy that evening. I signed the first document. There was no going back. The document I signed that evening was not a dramatic one. It was a formal recusal request, a written record, submitted to Dr. Bernard Acaffer's office, stating that due to a personal relationship with the patient scheduled for surgery on March 14th, I was voluntarily recusing myself from direct surgical involvement and requesting assignment of a supervising attending. This was standard practice. It was the right thing to do. It was also a document that established, in writing, that I knew the patient and that I had disclosed the relationship proactively and without being asked. Sandra Ife Clark, my attorney at Brennan, Ife Clark and Moss, had advised me to do this when I called her the previous week. If there is any subsequent question about how the case was handled, she had said, in her precise, unhurried way, you want the first document in the file to be one that shows you self-identified the conflict and reported it immediately. That's the document that ends most conversations before they start. I trusted Sandra's judgment. I had worked with her on 3 separate professional matters since the directorship contract, and her consistent quality was that she saw around corners. She did not just answer the question in front of her, she answered the questions that were 3 questions away. The day after I signed the recusal request, I sat in Anya's office and we talked for 40 minutes. The conversation was specific and purposeful in the way that conversations between surgical colleagues usually are: no preamble, no softening, just the structure of the problem laid out and examined. Walk me through what you know about their financial situation, Anya said. What I know professionally: the insurance policy lapse, the delayed specialist appointments, the hypertensive management that is inconsistent enough to complicate the surgical recovery window. What I know personally: my brother's 2 failed businesses which I have direct knowledge of, my father's back surgery 12 years ago which ran over what the insurance covered, the college fund. The college fund is personal knowledge, not institutional. Yes. Does it appear anywhere in the medical records? No. Good, it stays personal. It's not part of the institutional record. Anya picked up her pen, turned it over. What are you actually trying to accomplish, Miriam? Not the surgical outcome, that's handled. What do you want from the other thing? I thought about this for a moment. I want them to understand what I built, I said. I want my father to know who is standing in front of him. Not for vindication, I don't need vindication. But there's a difference between a family that doesn't know something and a family that has been given the information and still fails to reckon with it. I've been living in the first category for 20 years. I'd like to move into the second. Anya nodded. She did not say this was rational or irrational, generous or punishing. She said, then you need the records from Grayfield and Harmon, the Whitmore Fellowship documentation, your publication record, and your employment history as a formal document that can be produced. She wrote a short list. Sandra can put together the professional portfolio as a notarized package. It has no legal function, but it creates a paper reality. A paper reality, I repeated. People believe paper, Anya said. They disbelieve people. Even the same information on paper lands differently. I took the list. I contacted Sandra. I gathered the records over the following 10 days. My Grayfield transcripts, my Harmon degree and residency completion certificate, the Whitmore Surgical Fellowship Award letter, my 12 peer-reviewed publications from the previous 8 years, and my employment history at Callaway, including the formal appointment letter for the chief of surgery position, signed by Dr. Acaffer. Sandra assembled these into a bound document. She had the copies notarized by a notary at her firm and prepared a cover letter on Brennan, Ife Clark and Moss letterhead that stated these were true and certified copies of the professional records of Dr. Miriam Osai-Bonsu, verified as of the current date. The document was not for a court. It was not for an insurance claim. It was for my family, and it was the most precise thing I had ever prepared for them. It was the answer, in paper form, to the bank statement on the kitchen table 40 years, not 40, 20 years ago. I keep getting the time wrong in my memory. It feels like 40. It was during this period that Calvin called again. He caught me on a Wednesday evening at 6:15, when I was leaving the hospital. I was in the parking structure, my keys in my hand, when my phone rang and I looked at the screen and decided, for reasons I did not fully examine until later, to answer. "Miri," Calvin said. "Hey, I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I'm here," I said. "So Dad told me you work at Callaway, that you're a surgeon there." "I am," I said. "Chief of surgery." He said it the way my father had said doctor 20 years ago, like the name of a country. Except Calvin's version had something softer in it, not quite wonder but adjacent. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "How long has that been going on, Miri?" And here was the question that could have unraveled everything if I had answered it the way it was possible to answer it, with the full account, the 20 years, the accumulation of it. Instead I said, "A while, Calvin, I've been at Callaway 11 years. And you never said anything." "Neither did you," I said. "You never asked." Another pause, longer. Are you going to be involved in Dad's surgery?" "I've recused myself from direct involvement," I said, which was true. "The surgical team is excellent, he's going to be well taken care of." "Okay," Calvin said. "Okay." He seemed to be processing something. I waited. "Mom wants to know if you'd come have dinner before the surgery at the house." I looked at the ceiling of the parking structure, concrete and fluorescent light, and a pigeon walking along a crossbeam with the blameless purposefulness of a pigeon. "Tell Mom I'll be in touch," I said. "That's not a yes," Calvin said. "No," I said, "it's not." That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. I called Sandra the following morning and confirmed the timeline for the notarized portfolio. She said it would be ready by the 10th. The surgery was the 14th. I had 4 days. The dinner invitation came in writing, eventually. A text from my mother on the 7th of March. Formal in the way my mother was formal even in texts, stating that the family would be gathering at the house on the 12th to see my father before his surgery, and that it would mean a great deal to everyone if I came. She listed who would be there: Calvin and his girlfriend Renee, my Aunt Vivienne and her husband, 2 cousins whose names my mother used as if they were self-evidently important. "A family gathering," she said. "Nothing complicated, just being together." I read the text 3 times. Then I wrote back, "I'll be there." What my mother understood that text to mean and what it actually meant were 2 different things, and I allowed the distance between them to remain undisturbed for 5 more days. I arrived at my parents' house on the evening of the 12th at 6 o'clock. The house was the same house I had grown up in, a brick split level on a quiet street in Decatur that my parents had owned since before I was born. The kitchen had been repainted at some point in the past decade. The Formica table was still there. Calvin opened the door. He looked at me for a moment. In person, after several years, we were doing the arithmetic of change on each other's faces, and then he stepped back and let me in. The family was assembled in the living room and the kitchen. My Aunt Vivienne, who had always been the most socially agile person in any room she occupied, stood up and embraced me and said it had been too long and I looked wonderful. My cousins nodded. Calvin's girlfriend Renee, whom I was meeting for the first time, shook my hand with a genuine warmth that I appreciated. My father was in his chair in the living room. He had the posture of a man who has recently received information he is still arranging. He looked at me when I came in, and something moved across his face that I did not try to name. My mother came out of the kitchen and embraced me briefly, and said she was glad I came and would I sit down. Dinner was almost ready. I sat down. The dinner was the kind of family dinner that is organized around the avoidance of a specific subject by addressing many adjacent subjects. Calvin talked about a new project he was considering, something in property management. He was looking into it. Vivienne talked about her garden. My cousins talked about a trip one of them had recently taken. My mother moved between the kitchen and the dining room table. My father ate quietly and said little. At some point after dessert, when the table had been cleared and the coffee was on, my mother looked at me and said, "It's wonderful that you've done so well at the hospital, Miriam. You must have worked very hard." "I did," I said. "We always knew you were capable," she said. "We just worried you were taking on too much, too young. Your father and I only ever wanted to protect you from disappointment." I looked at her. I kept my hands flat on the table. "I know," I said. "Medical school," my father said, "not quite to anyone. 12 years, it's a long time." 17, I said, counting residency and training. 20 if you count from the beginning. He looked at his coffee cup. The surgery will go well, I said. The team at Callaway is excellent. You'll be in good hands. My mother smiled the flat smile that meant she had processed something and was now reporting on it. That's a relief, she said. We're trusting you. She thought she had won. She had 2 more days. I drove home that evening, and I sat for a while in my car in front of my apartment building. The same habit I had since the parking lot at Grayfield. Since the night I had held an acceptance letter and felt the house still standing. And I thought about my mother's face when she said we always knew you were capable. And the specific quality of that claim, which was the kind of thing people say when they need to maintain their account of events, and the events have become inconvenient. I did not feel contempt for it. I felt something closer to clarity. I understood now what I had not understood at 22. The story my family had told about me was not a story about me. It was a story about what they needed to believe to remain comfortable. My actual life had been proceeding alongside that story, undisturbed, for 20 years. Sandra's portfolio was ready on the 10th, as promised. I had picked it up on the 11th, the day before the dinner. I had left it in the locked compartment of my car during the dinner, which had felt, in some way I didn't examine closely, like the right place for it to be. I was not planning to produce it dramatically. I was not planning a confrontation. What I was planning was something more precise and more permanent than a confrontation: documentation. Paper. The version of reality that people believe. The morning of March 14th began at 5:15, which was when I arrived at Callaway County Hospital for a triple-header OR day that had been on my schedule for 3 weeks. My father's surgery was the third case, beginning at 9. Dr. Fentress, Marcus Fentress, now the department's senior attending, the same man who had said you lead in the emergency laparotomy during my second year of residency, was the operating surgeon. I had briefed him thoroughly. He was excellent and I trusted him without reservation. The family was in the surgical waiting area by 7:30. I knew this because the charge nurse on the surgical floor, Diane Osai, no relation, the name coincidence had amused us both when I hired her, sent me a brief text. Your family is here, per your heads up. I was out of my second OR case by 8:45. I changed, went to the 4th floor conference room adjacent to the surgical waiting area, and asked Diane to invite the family in. They came in a group. My mother, Calvin, Renee, and Vivienne, who had apparently decided she was needed. They sat around one end of the long conference table. I sat at the other end. The room had 8 chairs, institutional gray carpet, a whiteboard on one wall with a dry erase drawing of what appeared to be a surgical flowchart left over from a previous meeting, and a window that looked out onto the hospital's south courtyard. Dr. Acaffer came in at 8:53. He was there because I had asked him to be, and because, as chief medical officer, his presence in a family briefing was not unusual when the chief of surgery had a personal relationship with the patient. He sat at the side of the table, between my end and the family's end, and said good morning, and explained briefly that Dr. Osai Bonsu had asked him to be present for the pre-surgery family briefing, which was standard practice for complex cases. My mother looked at him. She looked at me. Something was different about the room, and she could feel it, the way you can feel a change in atmospheric pressure before you have conscious access to the information your body is receiving. Before we go into the surgical details, I said, I want to make sure the family has a complete understanding of the care team and the institutional context for today's procedure. I placed the portfolio on the table. Sandra's bound document, covered in the firm's letterhead, notarized tabs visible at the edges. I've prepared a document that outlines my professional background since I understand the family may not have been fully informed of my career history. This includes my educational record, my research publications, my employment history at this institution, and my current position. I'll leave copies with each of you. I slid a copy to my mother. I slid one to Calvin. I slid one to Vivienne. No one spoke. My mother opened hers. She turned the first page. She turned the second. On the third page was the appointment letter from Dr. Acaffer's office, dated September 3rd, formally naming Dr. Miriam Osai Bonsu as Chief of Surgery at Callaway County Hospital, with his signature. She looked at Dr. Acaffer. He gave her the small professional nod of a man confirming a fact. That was the first document, I said. I have 3 more. That was the moment I saw my mother's composure do something I had never seen it do in 43 years of watching her maintain it. It did not collapse. It did not break. It simply paused. Her hands on the table went completely still. Her face did not change in any way I could have described specifically, but the quality of her stillness was different. It was the stillness of someone who has just revised, at significant speed, their understanding of a very large thing. Calvin was holding his copy open, at the fellowship page. The Whitmore Surgical Fellowship Award letter, dated 7 years earlier, $12,000, the University of Georgia System seal. He looked up at me. "Miri," he said. "I know," I said. "You've been this whole time." "Yes," I said. Vivienne, who had always been the most socially agile person in the room, was not being agile. She was reading. I opened the second document, my publication record. 12 peer-reviewed articles in general surgery journals. I did not read the titles aloud. I placed the pages in the center of the table. Your father's surgical team is led by Dr. Marcus Fentress, who is Callaway's most senior general surgeon, I said. He has completed over 2,000 laparoscopic cholecystectomies. The case this morning is complicated by your father's hypertension and by the progression of the gallbladder deterioration, which was likely accelerated by the gap in his health insurance coverage last year, the 7 months during which the insurance policy lapsed, and he missed several specialist appointments and routine monitoring that would have been covered under his policy. I placed a third document on the table, the relevant pages from my father's medical records, the sections that outline the progression timeline, the notation of delayed care, the gap marked in the billing history. These are from his chart. He consented to my reviewing them as part of the pre-surgical consultation process. My mother said, very quietly, "You've been here 11 years. "Yes," I said, "and you never told us." "No," I said. She looked at the document in front of her. She looked at Dr. Acaffer. She looked at me. "Why?" she said. This was the question I had prepared for and had not prepared for. I had known it would come. I had not known, until it did, exactly what I was going to say. "Because you told me I was a drain," I said. "You told me I was a disappointment. You told me I was the kind of person who didn't become a doctor. And I understood when you said those things that my progress was going to have to be built somewhere other than in your field of vision. So that's what I did. I built it somewhere else. And then one day your husband's name appeared on my surgical schedule, and I had to decide what to do with that." Dr. Acaffer, who was a man of considerable professional composure, had gone very still in the way that people go still when they are witnessing something they recognize as significant. Calvin set his copy of the portfolio down on the table, his hands on either side of it. He had an expression I had not seen on Calvin's face before, something that was not his usual casual adjacency to events. He looked like a man who had just understood that he had been eating cereal in the kitchen of a story that was larger than he had been tracking. "I had the college fund," he said. "I had $43,000 from that fund, and you got $4,011, I said, and a suggestion that medical billing might be a practical alternative. Vivienne made a small sound, not quite a word. My mother looked at the table. The room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Dr. Osaibansu," Dr. Acaffer said, in the measured tone of a man who understood that his institutional presence in this moment was load-bearing. "If I may, I want the family to understand that Miriam's decision to disclose this relationship and recuse herself from direct surgical involvement was made proactively, in writing, before today. The care your husband and father receives at this institution is entirely determined by his medical needs. The quality of that care is not affected by any personal history." He paused. "What Miriam has built here at Callaway is, in my professional assessment, exceptional. That is a matter of institutional record." My mother looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at me. "Are you going to be there?" she said. "When he's in surgery, are you going to be there?" "I'm going to be in the hospital," I said. "Dr. Fentress is your surgeon, but I'm here." She nodded. It was a small nod, economical, the way she nodded at weather reports. "I owe you an apology," she said. The 3 words sat in the center of the table like the portfolio, specific, documented, present in a room with witnesses. "I know," I said. "Your father will too," she said. "When he's out." "I know," I said again. I looked at the window and the courtyard below where a nurse was walking across the concrete with a coffee cup, going somewhere with professional purpose, and I thought about a parking lot in Atlanta and a sealed envelope postmarked the day before a deadline and a pigeon on a crossbeam and a piece of paper folded into a wallet for 6 years. I thought about Jade Peterson screaming in Florida. I thought about Dr. Kweku not looking up from his chart and saying, "You have good hands." The surgery starts at 9, I said. Someone will update you as soon as there's news. I gathered the remaining copies of the portfolio and I stood up. Dr. Ackefer stood. Diane Ose appeared at the door, as if she had sensed with the professional precision of an excellent charge nurse that the room was at the end of something. I looked at my family one more time. My mother with her hands flat on the table. Calvin with his own copy open in front of him, still looking at it. Vivienne sitting very straight and very quiet. The portfolio pages spread out in the center of the table like the documentation of a life, which is exactly what they were. Take care of yourselves, I said. I'll see you after. My father came through surgery without complications. Dr. Fentress called me at 11:47 as I was reviewing notes in my office and said the procedure went cleanly, the gallbladder was out, the patient was in recovery and would be moved to a room by early afternoon. I thanked him. I stood at my window for a moment. Then I went back to work. I saw my father for the first time as a patient, as a man in a hospital bed and not a figure in a kitchen, at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He was awake and groggy from the anesthesia, which gives people a specific kind of candor. The guard is down, the processing is slow, and whatever rises to the surface rises without the usual editorial intervention. He looked at me when I came in and he said, "Miriam, how do you feel?" I said. "Like I had surgery," he said. "That's accurate," I said. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Your mother told me," he said, "about the meeting." He gestured vaguely at nothing, which I understood to mean the portfolio, the conference room, the 11 years, all of it. "I would have liked to have known," he said. "I know," I said. "I was wrong," he said. "About you." He said it the way he said most difficult things, without flourish, in a voice that was flat and direct, and I believed because I had heard him be dishonest and this was different. "I was wrong about what you could do. What you were." I sat in the chair by his bed. "I know that too," I said. He nodded. He closed his eyes. The monitors made their steady sounds. "You going to be all right?" I said. "I'll be fine," he said. "The doctor said the surgery went well." "He's a good surgeon," I said. "You were in excellent hands." My father opened his eyes and looked at me. "There were other good hands in this building today," he said. I looked at him. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle and fell on the hospital blanket. My father, 63 years old, thinner than I remembered, having just crossed a small threshold from which there was no retreat. I had thought for 20 years that the moment of accounting would feel like the completion of something. What it felt like, sitting in that chair, was more like the beginning of something I hadn't yet named. Something longer than the story I had been telling myself. Something that might, eventually, have different proportions. "Rest," I said. "I'll check on you tomorrow." I went home that evening and I cooked dinner for the first time in 2 weeks, rice and vegetable stew, the same thing I had made in the apartment after a long shift in my residency years, the meal that had always felt like proof that I was still taking care of myself. I sat at my own table and I ate, and I thought about what Anja had said. "You've built yourself a very elegant trap. For them or for me?" I still couldn't fully answer that. What I knew was that the trap, whatever it had been designed to catch, had been sprung. The paper was real. The room had been real. My father's voice in the hospital bed had been real. And my life, the career, the department, the 12 publications, the hands that had learned to hold instruments in the specific ways that good training teaches, my life was the most real thing in the room, and had been for years, regardless of who was watching. Calvin called me 2 days later. He did not have the easy casualness of previous calls. He sounded like a man who was working out how to say something he had not said before. "I should have said something," he said. "In the kitchen, that day with the bank statement, I should have said something." "Yes," I said, "you should have." "I didn't. No, I don't have a good reason for that," he said. "I know," I said. "I appreciate you saying so." There was a pause. "The portfolio," he said. "The thing the lawyer put together, can I keep my copy?" "It's yours," I said. My father was discharged from Callaway County Hospital on March 18, 4 days post-procedure, with a full recovery expected within 3 to 4 weeks. His discharge paperwork listed his attending as Dr. Marcus Fentress and his care team as the standard post-surgical nursing staff. My name did not appear on his discharge summary in any clinical capacity. I had not treated him. I had simply been present. In the institution I had built my career in, when the institution became relevant to his life. The paper reality of that, who I was, what I had built, what the document said, had done the work that 20 years of silence had positioned it to do. In the months that followed, my mother called me every 2 weeks, on Sunday afternoons, and we talked about things that were not the kitchen table and the bank statement. My father joined the calls occasionally. The conversations were not warm in any dramatic sense. They were civil and specific, and they were happening, which was different from what had been happening before, which was nothing. Anya asked me once, 6 months later, whether I felt I had gotten what I wanted from it. I wanted them to know what I built, I said. They know. And it turns out that was the easier part, I said. She nodded her small, precise nod. I remained chief of surgery at Callaway County Hospital. My department has, in the past year, achieved the lowest post-operative complication rate in the institution's recorded history. We are currently conducting a multi-site research collaboration on laparoscopic outcomes in hypertensive patients, a study I designed in part because of what I read in my father's medical records: the gap in care, the delayed specialist appointments, the consequences of an insurance policy allowed to lapse for 7 months. If it produces findings of use, and I believe it will, the dedication page of the published study will say what dedications say without specifying its target. People who know the story will understand. I have a plant on the windowsill of my office that has been there since my second year as chief. A small fern that Diane brought in on a Tuesday for no particular reason except that she thought it would look nice, and she was right. I water it on Thursday mornings before the first OR case. It is a small, ordinary thing, and I keep it because it is mine. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The work you do in silence is never invisible. It accumulates in documents, in institutional records, in the specific knowledge your hands carry, and when the time comes for it to be seen, it will be more credible than anything you could have announced. 2. Paper is not bureaucracy. It is the form that truth takes when it needs to survive a room full of people who want to remember things differently. 3. The person your family decided you were, and the person you actually became were never the same person, and you are not required to spend your life arguing the difference when you can simply spend it proving it. Was I wrong to keep my career hidden from my family for 11 years, to let my father be admitted to my hospital, read his chart, and walk into that consultation room without warning them first? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.